Hello, and welcome to the very last episode of the second season of Sunday Stories Live, brought to you by the 1947 Partition Archive, a global non-profit, non-governmental organization that works tirelessly to preserve the nearly lost oral histories of partition and has documented the life stories of more than 9,700 witnesses to the South Asian partition of 1947. The Oral History Project is the largest of its kind in South Asia. And with perseverance, passion, and dedication, they have made it possible to preserve unique stories in about 750 different cities across 18 countries. Sunday Stories is an event series that will bring to you insightful and informative conversations with academics, scholars, writers, historians, artists, poets, filmmakers, and musicians, as well as people's personal stories of the partition. Like the name suggests, it will take place every Sunday at the same time. So be sure to tune in. Today, however, marks the end of the second season, but we will be back very, very soon with a new season and more interesting conversations. My name is Sonam Kalra. I'm a musician with my own personal interest and body of work on partition. And this is a conversation I've truly been looking forward to since he agreed to come on our show. Today, I will be in conversation with the wonderful writer and equally wonderful human being, Salman Rashid. Salman Rashid is Pakistan's leading travel writer. He's the author of 12 travel books and has also written a personal story, A Time of Madness, a memoir of partition. Salman Rashid is Pakistan's most widely traveled travel writer, with very few places in the country that do not carry his footprint. He's acclaimed as the most erudite travel writer of Pakistan. His articles on places far and wide in Pakistan, from Nagarparker, as he corrected me earlier, in the south to Broghil in the north, have appeared in nearly all the major English language newspapers and journals in the country. Salman's books include The Apricot Road to Yarkand, Jhelum, City of Vitasta, Sea Monsters and the Sun God, Travels in Pakistan, Salt Range and Potohar Plateau, Prisoners on a Bus Travel Through Pakistan, Between Two Burns on the Map, Travels in Northern Pakistan, Gujranwala, The Glory That Was, Riders on the Wind, Diosai, Land of the Giant, a memoir of Pakistan, of course, From Landi Kotal to Vaga, Cultural Heritage along the Grand Trunk Road, and Gwadar Song of the Sea Wind. You will forgive me for getting some of these pronunciations wrong. These sound like places I've never heard of but would love to go to. Salman, I wish I was as brave as you to travel to all these places. Salman is also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society UK, and the only Pakistani to have seen the north face of K2 and trekked in the shadow of this great mountain. His work, his explorations, history, travels regularly appear in leading publications and on his blog. Salman, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us and for agreeing to share your very personal story. I know you've written 12 travel books, but I think that I would like to talk about what turned out to perhaps be the most important journey of your life, the memoir you wrote, A Time of Madness, a memoir of partition. Just to summarize the book from what I've read, the book basically says that during the chaos of partition in 1947, something dreadful happened in the city of Jalandhar in Punjab. As a result of this, Salman Rashid's family fled Jalandhar for Pakistan, the newly created country, across the border. They were among the nearly 2 million people uprooted from their homes in the greatest transmigration in the history of humanity. Besides those who fled, other members of the family became part of a grimmer statistic. They featured among the more than 1 million unfortunate souls who paid with their lives for the division of India and the creation of Pakistan. After living in the shadow of his family's tragedy for decades, in 2008, Salman Rashid made the journey back to his ancestral village to uncover the truth. He traveled to Jalandhar in the hope of meeting the man who had killed his family. A Time of Madness tells us the story of what he discovered with great poignancy and grace. It's a tale of unspeakable brutality, but it is also a testament to the uniquely human traits of redemption and the resilience of the human spirit. As people have reviewed it and said that this is a very balanced view on the partition of 1947, sharing stories from both sides, and they say that the author's voice is neutral and empathetic. So, Salman, I want to thank you so much for being here today. It really does mean the world to us to have you and to be able to finish this season with someone with a voice like yours.
Thank you very much, Sonam. It's a pleasure to be here. A pleasure indeed.
So, Salman, I want to ask you, I mean, I've introduced your book a little bit, but when I was reading your book, and I know that we'd spoken about your book earlier as well, I just I had to wrap my head around it. I had to wrap my head around how amazing it was of you to want to retrace this dark time in your family's history. I want to understand from you. Walk us through your story and tell us why you wanted to retrace this dark time in your family's history.
Right. I was I wasn't part of partition. I was born in 1952 in Lahore. But in our family, my father, my uncle, my chacha, that is, and my bua, they never spoke of partition. Uh, it was never mentioned. Um, and we didn't know what became of my grandparents, a great grandfather, and two of my father's sisters who never made it to Pakistan. So the conclusion was that they were killed. You see, there was in the back of my mind, or not in the back, in my head, it always went around that there must be someone who should be able to tell me what actually happened. And funnily, in 1997, when there was on the 50th anniversary of independence, when there was this great exchange of journalists and writers from each side to the other, I also was asked to apply for a visa by the newspaper I wrote for. But at the Indian High Commission, um, this uh, bouncer type came up to me and said, "Saab, aap jaiye, aapko visa nahi milne ka." I don't know
Interesting.
what it was. He just told me to, and very politely, very kindly, very nicely. It wasn't threatening at all. And so I just gave up. And then in 2008, when Satyabrata Pal was the High Commissioner here, he invited my wife Shabnam and I to dinner one day. And the first thing I said to him and his wife, as we were welcomed by them at the door, that India was the only country to have ever refused me a visa. And I got my visa, and it was for all the places I wanted to go to. Um, so the journey was to the basic function or the purpose of this journey. Knew my family, and actually, you see, at the time of partition, my father was divisional engineer, Northwestern Railways at Delhi. And
Okay.
my uncle, his younger brother, was doing his house job after having completed from King Edward Medical College in Lahore. He was doing his house job in Irvine Hospital. My grandparents and my eldest Bua were in Jalandhar, but the youngest, the baby of the family, Tahira, was in Solon with her older sister, whose husband was a surveyor in the Survey of India.
Okay.
So, and in August, the younger sister, having completed her BA, I think it was, Tahira having completed her BA, was visiting Solon, to get away from the Punjabi heat. And this I heard from my uncle many years later, in '97, actually, when there was this great exchange, and my uncle That was the only time he spoke of the partition. He said that he received a letter from Solon, from Tahira, saying, please take me from here and take me home to Jalandhar because this place is very tense. Yeah, this was, my uncle received that letter on the 6th or 7th of August. So he took the train up to Solon, collected his sister, stayed a night with his brother in law and sister, collected his sister, and they rode the trains back to Jalandhar. They arrived in Jalandhar on the 10th, and because my uncle, the riots had already started, and there was much work for a doctor to do in the hospital, and my uncle couldn't get extended leave. So he was at home. He was home for only about a day, and then back in uh, Delhi. That was the last time he saw his family. The interesting thing is that my father, who was the DEN, had having opted for Pakistan, had already in the end of July been transferred to Karachi. So he wasn't there. And my grandfather, this we know from our Masi, who said that he said, all right, so if there's going to be a Pakistan, and if Rasheed wants to live in uh, Pakistan,
Karachi.
that's all right. And we'll keep going back and forth. We'll meet as we've always met people from. I mean, there was just no concept of there being a divide.
An iron curtain, yeah.
I'm sorry?
An iron curtain, as there is now. There was no concept of it being
Yes.
so sort of one of those places you could never actually cross, never that
Yes.
sort of border, yes.
Yeah. This is the real Iron Curtain. And partition was the mother of all holocausts. I mean,
Yes.
they were of different religions or different ethnicities. We were the same people, we Punjabis. We got at each other's throats for no reason at all. So, um, uh, in September, my uncle was still in Irvine Hospital when the government wanted volunteer doctors to work in the refugee camps of Punjab. My uncle volunteered to work in Jalandhar. He came to the settlement commissioner's office and he asked if there were any Muslims left in Jalandhar, and the man said that there wasn't a single Muslim. And my uncle didn't have the courage to go home. Anyway, he wouldn't have found out anything. Anyway. So there was, we never really knew what actually happened. And I arrived in. So I began my journey not in Jalandhar. I arrived in Amritsar. I took the Shatabdi Express to Delhi, to Irvine Hospital. Then I took the trains, the same train that my uncle would have taken to Solon. In Solon, I met this wonderful young assistant commissioner, a woman. Her name is in my book. I forget it now. And she was very, very helpful. Uh, I wanted to see the house where my Bua and her husband were hiding in the servants' quarters in the lee of the doors. You know that in the lee of the door, when you open it in the old days, there was plenty of space for a person to hide behind. When the crowd came for them, and then my aunt once told me that they threw open the door, shone a lighted faggot inside, and they said she heard the voice saying, "I'm Muslim dog again." And my uncle eventually made it to his boss's home, who was a white man, a Britisher, and they were rescued and sent to Pakistan. So I wanted to see that house. The house had been pulled down, and a school or something had been made in its place. Um, and then I took the train back to Jalandhar, and I had a picture which is we have it over here. I had made a large photocopy of this image, which an uncle, my mother's cousin, had gone to Jalandhar in 1985. He had brought back this picture of my grandfather's house, and I had made an enlargement of it. I asked my friends. I was staying at Desh Bhagat Hall, and I asked Gurmeet Singh if he knew this building. He said, "Yes, yes, this is uh, uh, that great hero who killed the British policeman, Bhagat Singh."
Bhagat
Uh,
Singh, right, right.
it's in Bhagat Singh Chowk. So I got on this bicycle rickshaw and I told the man to take me to Bhagat Singh. I was holding this image in my hand. I think it was like a scene out of a movie. And then
Yeah,
I saw the building up front, and I walked on this side of the street looking at the house, and then I went across. My grandfather had two shop fronts on the ground floor overlooking the street, and one of them was run by this young Sikh person. I went into him. He thought I was a customer, and he says, "What can I do for you?" I said, "No, this is my grandfather's property, and I've just come to see it." The man got up from behind the counter, came around, and he hugged me very warmly. And then we sat down. He was doing his business. I sat down there and looking at the street, and suddenly he put his hand on mine and he said, "Was your grandfather a doctor?" And that was a shock. I hadn't said anything at all. I said, "How do you know?" He says, "I've heard the whole story. I know what happened to the family." And then he said, there was a 2-year-old child who was flung from the roof into the courtyard. And I said, "But we didn't have a 2-year-old child in the family." He says, "No, no, there was a 2-year-old child." And then he said, "Fine." then there began this exercise of trying to locate the person. He took me to several houses. I met the Suri family living in a back street. Wonderful elderly couple, both nearing 90, and full of stories. The lady of the house was from Lahore. The Suri Saab was from Rawalpindi, and they were so full of stories. Uh, but they were no good for me. Someone
yeah.
else who should have done the needful. And I went around talking to every elderly person, but meanwhile, Iqbal Singh would say, "I have to think hard. I cannot remember who exactly it is. It's an elderly customer of mine. That much I remember." I was 6 days in Jalandhar. On the sixth, on 5 days in Jalandhar, I had to be on the evening of the fifth day. I had to be in Amritsar to cross the border the next morning.
Before 4, no, at 4 p.m. or where is it?
Before the
I thought that the border closes at 4. So I recall you
yeah,
saying you had to cross the border at 4. Yes, I think.
four, no, yes, 4 in the afternoon. But I wanted to be with
Yeah.
some friends in Amritsar. We have friends
But
there.
this shopkeeper that who was being so incredibly helpful to you, he kept telling you that he remembered that one of his customers knew your grandfather, or what was it that he would tell you, or knew the house, or
He said, "This customer told me exactly what had happened to the family. He knew the whole story." That's what he had said. He knows the whole story, and would you like to meet him? And I said yes. And then the next morning, even before Iqbal Singh came to open the store, I was sitting on the threshold, and that happened 4 days running. On the second last, on the penultimate day in Jalandhar, I had to go to my village, Uki,
okay.
where Sardar Saudagar Singh was hosting me very kindly. I met his son at Desh Bhagat Hall. Um, I don't know, he was either part of a drama group or had come to watch the drama. And when he heard that my family was from Ugi, he came to me Bakhshi Singh, a very handsome, clean-shaven Sikh, tall and very, very good-looking. He insisted that I come with him straight away, and I said, "No, I have to do something in Jalandhar tomorrow," and he thought I was afraid of traveling with him. I had to put him at ease that no, 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 I am not afraid of traveling with you or with anyone else.
Yeah,
I'll
exactly.
be yeah. I'll be there a day after tomorrow, very early in the morning. So I was in Ugi with them. He says, "Manu yaad aa gaya. I remembered, I recalled, and I've spoken with him, and he also wants to see you." I
Iqbal,
was
sorry,
so
your voice broke a bit. Your voice cracked a bit, but you're saying Iqbal Singh spoke to you, called you when you were in Ugi to tell you, or when you.
yes. When I was in Ugi, we were sitting down to lunch when Iqbal Singh called to say, I remembered, and I've spoken with the gentleman, and he would also like to see you. He's
My
very
gosh.
keen to see you. You cannot imagine my excitement. I don't know. It's not excitement. It was something else. I was just outside my own self, and so
Of
that
course.
Salat Singh said, "No, no, take it easy. Have your meal, and Bakshish will drive you to Jalandhar." So Bakshish drove me to Jalandhar, and but there was, as I was crossing the street, I saw this stocky, elderly gentleman sitting in Iqbal Singh's store. And we were introduced, Mahinder Pratap Sehgal and I, Dr. Badruddin's grandson. The minute these introductions began, I took out my voice recorder, and this was very, very fortunate because a very essential piece from this conversation would have been lost. I held out my voice recorder, and Mahinder Pratap Saab said, ਵੇਖੋ ਜੀ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੋਂ ਬੜੀ ਮਾਫੀ ਮੰਗਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਮੇਰੇ ਪਿਓ ਦਾ ਸੀ
Gosh.
and yes and then
I
he
can't
took me
even
by
begin to imagine how you would have felt at that moment to
uh,
hear that
I,
apology.
I was quite almost like thunder. I was actually very taken aback. I didn't register the import of this apology. And it was like I was no longer, I was now witnessing the whole thing from another person's perspective, as if I was floating above the whole thing, as if this was now a movie unfolding in front of me. It was very surreal. He took me by the hand and he says, "Come, let me show you how it happened."
Oh my
And
God.
then he took me. I had already established, I had asked him his age. He said he was 73 years old. This was 2008 now.
Mm.
And he was 73 years old, which made him about 13 or 14 at the time of partition. So he took me by the hand and we went into Krishna Gali and then turned right to go to the Sehgal residence. They were neighbors also. My grandfather was living on the facing the railway road, the main road, and Sehgal Saab was living in the alley behind. And he took me into this house and he says, "Your family was hiding here." And now, very interesting, as we were walking past the wall of my grandfather's house, Mahinder Pratap Saab said, "This was Idu's room." Idu was my grandfather's servant. I hadn't even mentioned the name. He remembered everything. And he says, "This was Idu's room." It was all Idu's error. When the mob came screaming in from Railway Road, Idu was in this room with his 2-year-old son. And he panicked and ran for the Chopra's house where your grandfather was hiding. I said, "No, my grandfather would have been with Lala Bhikchand Sehgal, who, and my grandfather and Lala ji were the same age, and they had both retired from government service. They were very close friends, and my mother once told me that they spent most of their retirement hours together, and they were living. Both were facing the front railway road, and with Krishna Gali in between. But Sahil Saab said, no, 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 because everyone knew that your grandfather and Bhikchand ji were very good friends. They would have suspected your grandfather and the family were hiding there. So they were hidden in the Chopra's house. He took me to this house, showed me the room where he said they were all hiding. And he says, when the mob entered Krishna Kali, Idu panicked and he bolted from this room with his 2-year-old son. And Mr. Sahil said, Michael Pratapji said, if my father hadn't followed him, no one would have known where he went. But he went straight into the Chopra's
Oh gosh.
home, and my father was right behind him. Idu tried the door of the room they were hiding in. It was bolted from inside. So he ran up the stairs. The senior Mr. Sahil ran up after him, stabbed him to death, and flung the child into the courtyard below. So that was the 2-year-old child I had not known of. Idu had his wife and 4 children hiding with my grandparents. And Mahendra Pratap remembered, he said there was a hole in the door, so someone stuck a single barrel shotgun inside and fired a single shot. Your grandfather was hit in the head. So, and then he said it was very deliberate. They undid one of the panels on top, undid the bolt, and then they went in and killed everyone. I said, how are you so sure they killed everyone? He says, because no one was allowed to come out of that room alive. And in the evening, we saw them taking these bodies. I didn't put this in my book, it was too grisly. But he said, we saw them taking the bodies on a push cart to burn at the Pathan's timber yard. Um, uh, and that was the story. And when we were standing outside, we came outside and we were standing in the shadows talking about how it had all happened. So I said to him, Mahendra Pratap Sahab, I called him Bhaiji. I said, Bhaiji, why did this have to happen? And he said, "Oh, bada pagalpan da vela si." It was a time of great madness. That's where the title of my book comes. And but I cannot get over the fact that Mahendra Pratap had this greatness in his soul to bear his father's guilt all through these 60 odd years, and then the courage to seek my forgiveness. He had nothing to do with the killing. He was 13 years old. I asked him, I said, as I said, it all became like a very fast moving film for me.
So
And I
much to
wasn't
take
quite
in.
registering everything.
It's too
Yes,
much to take in, I can imagine.
uh, yeah, right. So I said, you were 13 years old at that time. What were you doing with the mob? And he stood back and put he went arms akimbo, and he said, "You're not listening to me. I told you it was my father's folly. Eh, mere pyo ne sari and the word he used was tang dil bewakoof for his own father. So
Oh my gosh.
strong was his guilt.
So
And
much
I
anger,
asked him
perhaps, as well.
as well. And he kept referring to my grandfather as Sade Dr. Saab, our Dr. Saab. I mean, there was
Gosh.
this oneness. Eh,
Salman, I can't. I mean, I hope everyone can hear you because I know you're having connectivity issues and we can't see you that well. I am tempted to ask you to restart your computer, maybe if you think you can, and we'll be able to see you because I think to be able to see your face at this moment is very important for all of us. To be able to hear everything that you're saying it's of great import. So perhaps, Salmanji, if you would just maybe try and restart your computer because you are cracking up. Or maybe choose the internet connection, just refresh it. We can't hear you. Salmanji, would you like to restart your computer maybe and see if that helps?
I'm doing it right now.
All right.
Doing
Okay.
it.
Okay. While we wait for Salmanji, I'm going to read you something from his book. He talks, there's a beautiful story, and I'm just going to find it. You have to give me a second. There's a beautiful story, and I say beautiful very carefully. It's a story of how goodness prevailed despite these difficult times. There's a story of how a large number of people were in a train fleeing the home they'd known for centuries, and I read from his book. The train had stopped, most of it on the bridge with only the last car still on the embankment, while the men on either side of the track waited for the refugees to alight. The noise was about killing them in retaliation because Muslims fleeing westward across India had been massacred. For the first time, Darshan Singh was truly terrified. I did not ask him, but I imagine he would have clung to a parent and asked if they were all going to die. No one moved. Darshan Singh does not remember how long this situation lasted. But gathering the mob, one of them called out, "In the name of God, hold your ground. Do not advance on us, for we are unarmed. The driver refuses to take this train across the border. Please permit us to cross on foot. Do no mischief to any of us." And Salman writes that in that one instant, from the stories he's heard, something went very right. Something inexplicably human took place. The inherent goodness that lives, even if in small measures, in all human beings, came to the fore. The gathered crowd, armed with guns, clubs, swords, and farm implements ready to kill and rape, quietened down. Moments slipped by. The only sound to be heard was the pattering of the thickening drizzle on the steel pans and the carriage roofs. At length, the terrified refugees, one by one, trickled off the train and made their uncertain way in the rain across the bridge to safety on the other side of the Ravi. The men who would have otherwise murdered them as compensation for the death of Muslims elsewhere silently let them leave. Darshan Singh recalls that once across the Ravi, the entire trainload of people just sat down, for no one knew where to go in the dark of the rainy night. Day broke, and they found the river bank and surrounding fields littered with hundreds of human corpses. The unfortunate Muslims whose cruel massacre these poor people nearly paid for with their own lives. And he says, Salmanji says, and I'm moving on to a paragraph dropping one saying, he says, I asked him what he thought was that, what was it that kept the Muslims from turning on these people at the bridge? And he says, the Paramatma dwells in the soul of all humans. There he kept those people from doing evil. Salmanji asked him, but then you saw hundreds of dead on the other side of the Ravi. What of them? It was a crime against humanity and the Paramatma. Those who killed the Muslims tried to kill God who dwells within our souls. And he talks of, in his book, Salmanji says that what if this goodness had prevailed throughout? So much could have been avoided. so much of the pain could have been averted. And that, in so many ways, is what he learned through this very important journey that he took back to Pakistan, back to Jalandhar. What he learned about the people who helped him, the people who were kind to him in helping him find this story. I think we're getting Salman ji on. Just give us a second. There he is.
I'm back.
There
Can you
you
hear me,
are.
Sonam?
I can hear
Hello?
you much better. Yes, I can hear you, Salman ji. I can. It's still a little pixelated, but we're not letting you go this time because it's your too far. There you are. It's far too important. I was reading from your book just now. You know, I was talking of when you talked of this time of madness, where he said Mahendra Pratap said this. I was also reading the story where um, we tend to dwell on the negative when we talk of partition. We tend to dwell on the hatred. But your book, I found, had so many stories of goodness and kindness. And I'm going to come back to ask you more about Mahendra Pratap, but I just want to digress for a few minutes because there's so many stories in your book, so many examples that you have seen yourself of people going out of their way to help you, from Iqbal Singh to Bakshish to all kinds of people, and you are no one to them. You are just someone from the other side who's come in search of his family. You could have been met with great amounts of hostility, saying, "Go away, we're not going to help you." And that's the incredible thing. Whether whoever goes, and I have heard these stories, I've experienced it myself. Whoever goes to each side, whether I go to Pakistan or you come to India or my relatives go, I know that it's always been people who have been so helpful. I'm quickly going to tell you a story also, which I want to share, of an aunt of mine. She went back to Lahore to find her house. And again, like you, her mother had given her this description. And she reached there, and apparently the nameplate was still on the house. And when she went in, she told this gentleman, and he said he remembered her father. They were good friends. He said, Betho. And then he went away for a moment, and she was wondering why he'd gone away. He took about 5-10 minutes, and then he came back. He said, मैं नमाज पढ़ने गया था कि मैं शुक्राना दूं कि मेरे दोस्त की बेटी आई मेरे घर. And then he showed her around the house. But the most special thing was, she tells me, and when I was collecting stories, she told me, she said, he took me out to his garden and he showed me a rose bush. And he said, this is the rose bush your father had planted. And I've always kept it because it was your father loved roses. So stories like that, people helping you. And that story in your book, which I just read from your book for the audience while we were waiting for you to come back, which talked of, how that entire mob left those people to cross the river to get to the other side of the Ravi. I mean, those are the stories we don't talk about enough. History books, narratives tell us the negative stuff. They say, people were killed, they were horrible, there's finger pointing, there's labeling, one community is bad, the other community is bad, one country is bad, and the other country is bad. And it's so much finger pointing. And these stories that, just by your own personal example, have been so very beautiful. I'm going to come back. I just want to come back to Mahendra Pratap. And you said, he had this incredible personality to be able to, I can't imagine. I think that it must have been so cathartic for him to finally release the guilt he felt on behalf of his father. It must have been amazingly cathartic for you. And strangely so painful. How did you feel? How did you fathom everything that you went through? Because in those 45 minutes, as you told me, of talking to him, you were actually replayed an entire lifetime of history, an entire history of your family. What was it like for you? How did you feel about him? How did you feel about the perpetrator in some ways?
I, 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 I actually, just the act that Mahendra Pratap Sahab sought my forgiveness straight off in the beginning raised him, in my estimation, immensely. I There was only a feeling of great respect for him. And later on, Shabnam and I, when we went back to India 3 or 4 times in the next couple of years, we always went to see him. We took gifts for him, and I did not feel any animosity or anything for Mahendra Pratap Sahab. I don't know if his, his father, who had died in 1973, if I remember correctly, him telling me this, um, I, I, I would probably have asked his father, why did he have to do it? What was the reason behind killing a neighbor who had been so kind to them that his son you remembered him as Sade Dr. Saab, our Dr. Saab.
And
Um,
your grandfather, in your book, and everyone who ever spoke of your grandfather said he was a man who was, he treated everyone equal. He always had the time to treat people of all faiths. So he was certainly, no
yes,
wonder he was seen as Sade Dr. Saab. Khurram Iqbal
yes,
wrote this, and I'm not going to paraphrase what he just said, but he said it would be 1,500 people were killed in his village. But he said, I hope that we can meet and hug each other and move forward. And I think that this whole thing of, in the US, they do have this in some places where they make the perpetrator meet the victim's family so that they can move forward to heal. And I think that it's so important. And in many ways, for you, I think doing this and the fact that you could take back gifts meant that you were bound by a common shared history and a common shared pain, which is what I think all Indians and Pakistanis are truly bound by. We
yes.
may not accept it, but the fact is, it is the absolute truth. What did you do after this conversation? You went back to Pakistan and you shared this story with your mother.
Yes, I told my mother only very briefly that they had all died, um, and that there was no chance of. I kept asking Mahinder Pratap ji if my aunts had been taken away. They were young. The youngest Tahira was 21 years old, or yes, yes, or 20 maybe. And he said, no, no one came out alive. Um, I told my mother that they had died. My father, my uncle, my other aunt had already passed on. So my mother was the only person left. She heard the story very briefly. I didn't give her the details at all. And
Did
uh, yes, please go on.
you mentioned, and this is something that I've heard from many people, but I also find it very interesting that you mention it. We all talk of, when we relate to, you said it, you said they didn't talk of partition much. My uncle never spoke of partition. No one ever spoke of it. And I find that the silences around partition are what has kept us from really delving deep. Of course, now many people are researching it. There's, of course, the Partition Archive is archiving so many stories, which are far more important than the histories and history books. They are the true stories of their living histories. Therefore, they're far more, their oral histories, they're more important. But why do you think there was this silence in your family? And what do you feel about these silences specifically about partition?
I think it was almost a criminal act to remain silent about it. It should have been spoken about. They could have perhaps given vent to their own uh, um, grief, and they could have passed on something to us to know of Jalandhar. We knew, we children knew very little of Jalandhar, and the only and whatever little detail we knew was from my Masi. She would tell my sisters stories, and my sisters later on passed them on to me. And the only time my mother ever spoke of Jalandhar was shortly before I went on this trip, and she told me, she gave me the geography of my grandfather's home, and my nana, my maternal grandfather's home, which was, somewhere in the back, on, I forget the name of the mahalla now. Um, we should have known more about Jalandhar, more about what happened to the family, more about the village and what kind of people lived there. In the village, for example, when I asked Sardar Saudagar Singh if there were any old families living in the village, he said Bakshish should take me to Pandit Fakir Chand Sangar. And but when I said to, there were two brothers, Banarsi Das and Pandit Fakir Chand, Pandit ji being the elder. I said, Panditji, I am Dr. Badruddin's grandfather. He was very excited. I said, did you ever see my grandfather? He said, did I ever see him? When he was a civil surgeon at Nakodar, I was doing my matriculation, and he liked me very much because in Ugi we were the only Hindu family, and he always addressed me as Pandita or Pandit. He would address me as Pandit, and every afternoon he would tell the staff to call me. I was in the boarding school, and he would have me come over to fill in the registers in Urdu because my Persian handwriting was very fine, and I would get char ane, 4 annas every day for the work. And he remembered how my grandfather dressed, the pastel colored ties and the light cotton suits, and uh, that he was very proper. And then he also remembered things that happened to my grandfather, for which I blame the politicians. The attempt of my grandfather to slaughter a cow in the village. In
Hmm.
our family, I don't know when we converted to Islam. I think because I have a family tree here which goes back 7 generations. I think before that we were Hindus, and in my family, my father was deadly against eating beef. I mean, mutton was fine, everything was all right, but beef was a total no-no. And my grandfather in 1946 tried to slaughter a cow in the village, uh, and there was this great brouhaha until the police and the deputy commissioner and the SP arrived and averted the whole thing, or things could have turned. And when I asked Pandit Fakir Chand why, how, what did he think about it, and he says, Dr. Saab, the kadam ukhad gaya si. Dr. Saab lost his footing, he lost his step, and
Yeah.
this is what politicians did to us.
Absolutely. I think it couldn't have been paraphrased better. I think they ensured that everyone lost their way. The
Yes,
same land where everyone lived together, where there was one. Someone once said, सब लोग ऊपर वाले को पंजाब में रब के नाम से जानते थे. And it didn't matter what that name, Rab was Allah, Rab was whoever you wanted it to be, whatever name you wanted to call God. And the very fact that you could take people who lived together, so together, as one family, and you could have ripped them apart and created this animosity. But in your book also, I mean, from not just from the stories, which is, I still would love you to tell me some more stories of how people helped you, and that's what's so amazing to me, that you come back after 68 years of partition, and it is 60 odd years, but it's still people willing to help you. There's no animosity you really face. But I kept sensing in your book that there's so much nostalgia in your story, even though you didn't live in Jalandhar. But there's this sense of, you wonder so many times in your book what your life would have been like had you lived in Jalandhar. But I also kept feeling in your book there was this deep desire, deep wish from your part for things to be normal. I want to know how you feel about partition, and how you feel, because I sense this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, how you feel about belonging to two different places. And I think every one of us has that to some degree. But how do you feel? Because I sensed it very much in your book. How you feel about belonging to both places?
I can only say it's a very great feeling to belong to both places. And I would have been a very happy man if, even if I don't get back that property, there's no way I can get back that property. But just the to be afforded the chance of going back to Jalandhar, to my village. There's a little pot over there with dust I brought home from Ugi,
Hmm.
and you know, I mean, I would really, really like to have the facility to travel between Lahore and Jalandhar and Ugi, and maybe even Solan and Delhi, wherever. Um, without all these
You,
restrictions.
you wrote in your book that you brought some dust back to put on on your father's grave. Did you write that in your book?
Yes, I did.
I
I
thought that
did.
was such a beautiful thought, and I can't imagine the number of people that I spoke to when I was researching partition who kept saying there was this repeat motif almost where everyone said we never thought we wouldn't go back, and they always still referred to it as home, wherever, because it was home for them. Wherever you grew up is home, where you spend most of your life, or you relate to it being home. Maybe not most of your life, because after partition, presumably they spent a large chunk in another part of the world. Um, Kathleen Mulligan says she did a project in Pakistan based on partition stories in 2015, and there were so many stories of people being kind to each other, almost as many as the stories of cruelty, and it truly inspired hope. Thank you, Kathleen. I think um, I was asking you what you feel about partition, and do you feel, Salman, that we haven't recognized truly the immense trauma and of partition and its aftermath because it goes on for generations? And do you think that everything is still so raw for all of us because there's never really been it wasn't a breaking of choice, but there's never been closure in some ways, right? There's never been a chance for people to sit together and talk about it. And how do you think we can heal from this? What would you do? What would your suggestion be or your hope be?
You see, closure will only come when we accept that we've. Some would call it folly. I don't know what it can be called, but we have created this divide. The only way to heal now is to sit down together, to meet each other, to cry on each other's shoulder,
Oh,
and and live in peace, for goodness sake. That's how closure will
absolutely.
come to us. I mean, there's no way. I don't think anyone wants, even in India, the people want Pakistan to be undone, and Pakistanis don't want Pakistan to be undone. But what we want undone is this iron curtain that divides us. We are the same people, for goodness sake. And you know, this until 1857, the War of Independence, there was no two-nation theory. It was crafted by the British when they saw that the Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs will stand together against a foreigner. And that's when the theory was crafted. And if you read Rajmohan Gandhi's Punjab from Aurangzeb to Mountbatten, the thing comes across even more clearly.
Yeah.
Uh, uh,
Rajmohan ji was our first speaker this season, and I mean, I have to. You told me earlier that he was our first speaker this season. He's also the person who pressured you to do this book, and I mean, I don't think that we can thank him enough for telling him or insisting. I think he nagged you pretty much to tell this story and tell you that it didn't just belong in a newspaper, but it needed to reach out to so many people. Tell me more about some of the stories of the people who helped you when you were here.
um, uh, Pandit Fakir Chand Sangar was one who had all these stories of my grandfather and how he transformed. And then, the deputy commissioner, Rakhila Kalon was her name, assistant commissioner in Solon. When I walked into her office unannounced, and I said, I've come looking for a house which belonged to the Survey of India, and she says, so far as she knew, those houses were not the property of the survey; they were rented out to them by owners. And then she said I should sit down a minute, and called for a man who had retired from service, but one of those old chaps who hold files very close to their chest, and who seem to know everything about everything uh, in their district. She called one of those gentlemen, and he said, "Yes, yes, I remember those two houses. There were two of them." And I mean, Rakhila was very, 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 very,
We're losing you,
Out of the way.
Samanji. Sorry.
She put everything me. Okay. Rakshila entertained me for about, I think, 45 minutes. And then she told the man that he should take me to the site where those houses stood. And this was very kind of her, really. And I
Yes.
said, if those houses are not there anymore, there's no point. I wanted to see those rooms where my relatives had hid themselves. And she was very kind. Um, in the divisional engineer's office in Delhi, I walked into this office. Outside it said D and one or two, I don't remember, but Bhupinder Singh, when I told him he was sitting in my father's seat, he got up, greeted me very, very warmly, and then called all his colleagues and said, "Look, his father was an assistant divisional engineer here in Solon." I walked to the railway station. I'm a train buff, and we don't have narrow gauge trains running in Pakistan anymore. But I went to the railway station just to watch the trains going by. Could only see one actually. And the staff were sunning themselves. It was March and Solon was cold. They were sunning themselves across the railway line from the railway station. Um, and I was looking through the windows. So they said, "Are you do you want to buy a ticket?" I said, "No, I'm just looking." And they called me over, and I said, "My father was assistant engineer here in 1946. He lived in Dharampur." And you should have seen that the fellow feeling, that love almost. The station master was so happy, and he said, "Would you like to see the house your parents lived in?" I said, "I would, but I cannot stop there. I don't have a visa for Dharampur."
Mhm.
And he said, "But that building is not even a house anymore. It's not a residence. It's a school to train young engineers." And in Jalandhar, across the street from my grandfather's house is this agency that sells bottled gas, run by Kailash Sehgal. The first day I got off that cycle rickshaw, I walked past Kailash Sehgal's store. Kailash Sehgal was born in 1948. And then I walked back again. So after I was talking to everyone. I went to see Kailash Sehgal Saab, and I said, "I'm Dr. Badruddin's grandson," and he said, "That's his house." And when you walked past my store on this pavement, and the way you were looking at this house, I knew you had a connection with the place. And so the day I was supposed to go to Ugi is about, I think, 40 kilometers from Jalandhar, the heart of Jalandhar. He said, "How are you going to go?" I said, "I'll hire a taxi." He says, "No, my man will come and get you and he'll drop you there." So in the morning, this man in a big, what they call a tampu in Punjab, a rickshaw,
Yes. Yes.
he arrived and took me to Jalandhar. I said, "How much?" He said, 400. So I gave him 400 rupees. And later that evening, when Bakshish Singh brought me back to meet Mahinder Pratap ji, I got off on that same side of the road as Kailash Sehgal's store. And he called out, "Rasheed sahab, ethe aao zara." And it was an angry, was snappish sort of thing. So I went into his store. He came around the counter, held my pocket out and stuffed something in it. I said, "What's this?" He said, "Eh, tusi ki kita? Why did you do this?" And I said, "What?" He says, "Why did you have to pay that man?" I said, I asked him, he said 400, so I gave him 400. He says, you shouldn't have done that. He's my employee. You were not supposed to give him anything. I mean, this was unbelievable.
I think that that's the thing that for me touched me the most about your book, and I know that it was incredibly hard for you, and I think incredibly brave of you to come back to take this journey to find this out for healing, for closure, for your family. But also, I think the stories that you encountered along the way, the people you encountered along the way, had also a huge part to play, perhaps, in the healing, which eventually prepared you for meeting Mahinder Pratap Singh in many ways. But I also think what's so important that you wrote about them is important that people hear of the entire, literally the villages that came together, the people that came together, the fact that there is still inherent goodness in people to come together to help you find this history. I'm just want to read with you because I've been reading your book the last few days, and I remembered a poem by Ali Sardar Jafri, which I was reading to you, but I'll read it again, where he says, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, इसी सरहद पे कल डूबा था सूरज होके दो टुकड़े, इसी सरहद पे कल जख्मी हुई थी सुबह आज़ादी, ये सरहद खून की, अशकों की, आहों की, शरारों की, जहाँ बोई थी नफरत और तलवारें उगाई थी, यहाँ महबूब आंखों के सितारे तिल मिलाए थे, यहाँ माशूक चेहरे आंसुओं में झिलमिलाए थे, यहाँ बेटों से माँ प्यारी बहन भाई से बिछड़ी थी, ये सरहद जो लहू पीते ही अंगारे उगलती है, ये सरहद फूल की, खुशबू की, रंगों की, बहारों की, ये सरहद मनचलों की, दिल जलों की, जानिसारों की, ये सरहद सर जमीने दिल के बांके शह सवारों की, ये सरहद गुलशन लाहौर और दिल्ली की हवाओं की, ये सरहद खून में लिपटे प्यार के जख्मी गुलाबों की, मैं इस सरहद पे कब से मुंतजिर हूँ, सुबह सुबह फरदा का, मैं इस सरहद पे कब से बैठा हूँ मुंतजिर, कि कटे रंजिश की शब और उगे सूरज मोहब्बत का. I truly think that your book, I think more and more people should read it because it truly is, as you so aptly describe, and perhaps because it was what Mahinder Singh said, was a time of madness.
It was absolutely.
There is no
It,
other way to explain.
that visually impaired gentleman I met in Putter Kala in 2010. He he moved. He spoke very explicitly of the killing. He was a policeman in 1947, a 19-year-old policeman. He spoke very explicitly of the killing he had done, and then he had been blind. He was 85 years old in 2010, and he had been blind for 25 years, and he kept saying, "मैं अपने पाप कारण अन्ना होया." Kept said that at least 2 or 3 times in the hour or so we spent together. He could not forgive himself for what he had done, and um, we really closure, as you said earlier. The only way for closure is to let people meet. We've got to. We must not forget what happened, but we must forgive. Remember and forgive. That's going to be the real closure.
I think that's absolutely correct. We must not forget what we must forgive, and we must remember so that we don't make the same mistakes again, because we do not talk enough about the fact that it was the largest displacement in the history of humanity, the fact that the number of families that were torn apart. We need to keep reminding ourselves. And thank you for writing this book, for sharing such a personal story with all of us. If you haven't read the book, please go buy it. I can tell you, you will be so moved by the many stories that Salmanji shares and all the wonderful people he meets. I can't thank you enough, Salmanji, for coming here. For me, today, just for the audience, today, of course, marks the last episode of this season. It also marks the last episode that I'm going to be doing. I may be back in a couple of seasons, but you have a lovely, wonderful host who's coming back for the next season. She's a Fulbright, she's an oral historian who's documented over 60 oral histories in Lucknow and Hyderabad. She's presently pursuing her PhD in the field of partition studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, as a Fulbright Nehru Scholar. I'd just like to introduce Parul very quickly so that you have a face to a name. Hi, Parul.
Hi, Parul.
Hi, Sonam. Hi, Rashid sir. Thank you so much for having me here. This was an extremely enlightening and insightful discussion. I don't know how many times I teared up while listening to your stories. Thank you so much for sharing. What's probably the most traumatic experiences in your life. I think you've given all of us a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on. And I love what you said, about what we want undone is the Iron Curtain. We're all the same people. So it absolutely amazes me how you can carry so much empathy and forgiveness in your heart. So thank you so much for opening up to us and to our audience. And like Sonam said, I am Parul Srivastav. I'm currently a Fulbright Nehru Doctoral Fellow at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I'm pursuing my PhD at the University of Hyderabad in India, and I'm a former story scholar at the 1947 Partition Archive. I'd like to thank Sonam for doing such an amazing job at hosting season 2 of Sunday Stories. You were fabulous, Sonam. You were absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm truly in awe of yeah.
So moved by your story. It's easy to just, to talk to people as wonderful as I've had the chance to, from Rajmohan ji to you. For me, this has been such an enriching time in my life. So thank you to the 1947 Partition Archive and Salman ji and all the wonderful speakers I've had a chance to speak with. Sorry, Parul, you were about to say something?
Yeah, I was just saying the same thing that, I am just in awe of all the beautiful conversations that you've had with so many people, like Salman sir, like Haroon Khalid, Priya Setia. I mean, for someone who's actually studying oral histories right now, I think each of your episodes are like treasure troves for me. So, I think I'll keep following them, time and again.
Well, we're going to be following you very soon, so it's going to be wonderful to listen to all the lovely conversations you have. I want to thank Salman ji. Honestly, thank you for opening your heart out to us. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I have to tell you that today and the last few days since I spoke to you first has made my heart weep and rejoice at the same time to know that there are so many of us that feel the same way about the pain of partition and the futility of it all. Thank you all for tuning in. It is truly, truly important that we acknowledge the pain on both sides and we stop pointing fingers. First, we must acknowledge the pain, the trauma, the heartbreak, and understand that the guilt that so many people on both sides carried. And I hope that personally, through the efforts of people who continue keep this dialogue to keep this dialogue open, like the 1947 Partition Archive, writers like Salman ji, artists, historians, oral history scholars, I hope that by keeping this dialogue open, we can find a way forward, one of peace, one of hope, and one of dialogue, and eventually of closure and a way forward. If you would like to support the work that we do with our oral history, with our mission at the 1947 Partition Archive, please consider making a donation of any size, because we rely 100% on donations as an NGO. In some countries, donations are tax-free, and I always say then that means you have no excuse. Links are in the description to this video. Thank you once again for being part of these stories, for being involved in our stories, and we will see you again very, very soon for season 3 for more insightful conversations on Sunday Stories with Parul, this time Parul Srivastav. Thank you so much. Stay safe, Salman ji. Thank you so much. And from India to Pakistan, from Sunday Stories to you, from the 1947 Partition Archive to you, we give you our love and our heart, and we hope that the Iron Curtain is lifted very soon.
Ditto.
Yes.
Thank you very much.